What Bradshaw does not know, standing on that flight deck, watching the smoke flatten and disperse in the Atlantic wind, is what Dönitz wrote in his war diary that evening when the loss was confirmed. What he wrote was not a tactical assessment, it was not a strategic calculation. It was something rawer than either of those things, something that revealed, in a few unguarded sentences, exactly what the Admiral thought of the Americans who had figured out how to find his milk cows, and what he believed it meant for everything that came after. Part 1. The Arithmetic of Starvation. The United Kingdom is an island. This is not a geographic footnote. It is the central strategic fact of every war Britain has fought since the age of sail. And by 1939, it had become something close to an existential vulnerability. The country required more than 1 million tons of imported goods every single week to function. Food, fuel, raw materials, the basic inputs of an industrial economy that had been built over 2 centuries on the assumption that the sea lanes would remain open. Close those lanes, and Britain does not merely struggle, Britain starves. Karl Dönitz understood this with the clarity of a man who had spent the First World War in submarines, and had watched the British respond to that earlier U-boat campaign with a desperation that told him everything he needed to know about how close it had come to working. He was born in Grunau, near Berlin, in 1891. He entered the Imperial German Navy in 1910, transferred to the submarine service in 1916, and was captured by the British in 1918 when his U-boat surfaced during a mental breakdown. His own words, recorded later, after weeks of relentless pressure. He spent the remainder of the First World War as a prisoner. He spent the years after it thinking about what had gone wrong and how to do it correctly next time. What had gone wrong, in Dönitz's analysis, was not the idea of submarine warfare against merchant shipping. The idea was sound. What had gone wrong was the execution. Too few boats, deployed in isolation, operating individually against a convoy system that the British had eventually organized well enough to blunt the campaign. His answer was the Rudeltaktik, the wolf pack, coordinated attacks by multiple submarines converging on a convoy simultaneously, overwhelming the escorts and sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. But wolf packs required something that the U-boat arm of 1916 had never had: range. Persistent presence in the mid-Atlantic, far from Allied air cover, far from the escort bases, in the so-called Black Pit, where convoys ran unprotected. And range required fuel. The standard German attack submarine of the Second World War, the Type 7, the workhorse of the Battle of the Atlantic, had a surface range of roughly 6,500 nautical miles at 12 knots. That sounds substantial until you look at a map. The convoy routes from North America to the United Kingdom and to the Soviet Union ran for thousands of miles. By the time a Type 7 had crossed from its base in occupied France to the mid-Atlantic hunting grounds, burned fuel hunting convoys, and turned back, it had already consumed a significant portion of its operational endurance. The boats were reaching their patrol areas with margins that made Dönitz uncomfortable. His solution was elegant in its logic and brutal in its demands. Build a new class of submarine, larger, slower, unarmed as a fighting vessel, designed entirely around carrying fuel and supplies. Send these supply boats to pre-arranged positions in the mid-Atlantic. Have the attack submarines rendezvous with them. Refuel, restock, and extend their patrols by weeks. Turn a 6-week patrol into a 10-week patrol. Turn a patrol that reached the mid-Atlantic into one that could push all the way to the Caribbean, the American eastern seaboard, the waters off West Africa. The Type 14 submarine was the result. 1,732 tons surfaced, 67.1 meters long, a crew of 53 men, no torpedo tubes, no deck gun after initial deployments. In place of weapons, she carried 432 tons of diesel fuel for transfer, 4 spare torpedoes, provisions sufficient to resupply multiple attack boats, and a compressed air system for replenishing the attack boat's own air supply. She was, in the language of naval architecture, a purpose-built fleet oiler in submarine form. The Kriegsmarine ordered 10 of them initially, then expanded the order. 14 would eventually be commissioned. In Dönitz's planning, they were not supporting assets. They were the central pillar of extended Atlantic operations. Stop and think about that. 14 submarines, no weapons, no ability to defend themselves beyond their ability to dive, sent to fix positions in the middle of the Atlantic to wait for attack boats to find them. Their security rested entirely on secrecy, on the Allies not knowing where they were, not knowing the rendezvous coordinates, not knowing when they would surface. The moment that secrecy broke, they were dead. And the secrecy broke almost immediately. Part 2. The signal that never stopped transmitting. Meet Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Knowles, 37 years old in 1943, born in New York City, a graduate of the Naval Academy class of 1927. Before the war, he had served on destroyers and had spent time as a naval attaché in London, where he developed relationships with British naval intelligence officers that would become crucial in ways nobody could have predicted in the peacetime 1930s. When the United States entered the war after December of 1941, Knowles was assigned to the 10th Fleet's Submarine Tracking Room in Washington, a small, deliberately understated office whose function was to know, at any given moment, where every German submarine in the Atlantic was, or was likely to be. The Submarine Tracking Room was not a glamorous posting. It was a room full of charts, a room full of people staring at those charts, a room full of radio intercepts and decoded signals, and the patient, methodical work of building a picture from fragments. But it was also, by 1943, one of the most important rooms in the entire Allied war effort, because the picture it was building was increasingly accurate in ways that the Germans did not know and could not have easily believed. Here is the key detail. Germany's naval communications ran through the Enigma cipher machine, a device whose operators were convinced produced unbreakable encryption. The British had been reading Enigma traffic since 1941, with varying degrees of success depending on which naval key was in use and whether the Bletchley Park cryptanalysts had current settings. The Americans, through a cooperative arrangement that represented one of the most productive intelligence sharing agreements in military history, had access to the same product. By 1943, the system the Allies called Ultra was producing decrypts of German naval signals with a regularity and a speed that, in the best periods, gave Allied commanders actionable intelligence within hours of a signal being sent. Dönitz was a heavy user of radio communications. He believed in centralized command, in maintaining close personal direction of his U-boat's movements, in sending detailed operational orders by signal rather than leaving commanders to exercise independent judgment. This was not stupidity on his part. It was a coherent command philosophy rooted in his understanding of the tactical situation, but it meant that the Kriegsmarine's submarine operations were conducted in a constant stream of radio traffic, and that traffic was being read. The milk cows were particularly vulnerable. Think about what a supply rendezvous required. Dönitz had to signal the supply submarine's position to the attack boats that would meet her. The attack boats had to acknowledge. Position corrections had to be transmitted. Timing had to be coordinated. Each of these signals was a transmission. Each transmission was a potential intercept. And the milk cows, sitting on the surface during the refueling process, a process that could take hours, were radiating their position with every signal they sent. But it was not only signals intelligence. There was a second thread, and this one the Germans were even less prepared for. By 1942 and into 1943, Allied forces in the Atlantic were increasingly equipped with high-frequency direction-finding equipment, HF/DF, called Huff-Duff by the sailors who used it. A submarine transmitting a radio signal did not merely send a message, it sent a beam, a direction, a bearing that a properly equipped ship or shore station could detect and triangulate. A single Huff-Duff station gave a bearing, 2 stations gave an intersection. 3 stations gave a fix accurate enough to send an aircraft or a hunter-killer group to investigate. The Germans knew Huff-Duff existed. What they consistently underestimated was how extensively it had been deployed and how quickly the Allies had learned to cross-reference Huff-Duff fixes with Enigma decrypts to produce targeting data of extraordinary precision. And then there was the third thread, and this one is the one that Dönitz's post-war writings circle around with the particular anguish of a man who still cannot quite bring himself to name it directly. The aircraft. The Allies were putting aircraft over the mid-Atlantic in numbers and with capabilities that the Kriegsmarine had not anticipated and could not easily counter. Long-range patrol aircraft, the American consolidated B-24 Liberator, modified for maritime patrol, the British short Sunderland flying boat, were extending their operational radius into the areas where the milk cows waited. These aircraft carried radar, they carried depth charges. They could cover in hours a search area that a surface ship would take days to patrol. And a submarine on the surface, riding low and slow while hoses were run between vessels and fuel was pumped across, was exactly the kind of target that radar was designed to find. Dönitz understood the aircraft threat in the abstract. He had been arguing since before the war that the Luftwaffe needed to provide dedicated maritime patrol and strike aircraft to support the U-boat campaign, and he had been losing that argument to Hermann Göring, who regarded the ocean as none of the Luftwaffe's business with a consistency that bordered on institutional negligence. By 1943, the mid-Atlantic was an air environment that the Kriegsmarine could not control and could barely contest. Those submarines were waiting in an ocean that was no longer safe for things that had to surface. Part 3. 14 boats, 14 losses. The first Type 14 to be lost was U-459. She was commissioned on the 15th of November 1941 under Korvettenkapitän Georg von Wilamowitz-Möllendorf, 52 years old, a decorated officer from a distinguished naval family who had commanded surface vessels before transitioning to the submarine service. U-459 conducted multiple supply missions in 1942 and early 1943, refueling dozens of attack boats and extending operations that would otherwise have been cut short. She was, by the standards of the milk cow fleet, a success story. On the 24th of July 1943, she was attacked in the Bay of Biscay by a Vickers Wellington bomber of the British Royal Air Force's No. 172 Squadron. The attack was not a chance encounter. It was the product of exactly the intelligence system described above: signals intercepts, direction-finding bearings, and the increasingly sophisticated Allied picture of where German submarines were operating. U-459 fought back. Her crew manned the anti-aircraft guns and engaged the Wellington. The Wellington's pilot, Wing Commander Wilfred Alton, pressed his attack despite taking hits. The aircraft was badly damaged. U-459 was damaged by depth charges and gunfire. In the confusion and the smoke, a collision occurred. Accounts differ on exactly what happened, but the outcome does not. U-459 sank. 41 of her crew were rescued by a Spanish destroyer that happened to be in the area. Wilamowitz-Möllendorf was not among the survivors. Read that back. The first milk cow lost. 41 survivors, her commander dead, and the Wellington that killed her was itself lost. Alton and his crew did not make it back either. This was the cost of the campaign on both sides, measured in men who had names and ages and people waiting for them at home. That loss was not an endpoint. It was an opening. U-462, U-463, U-487, U-488, U-489, U-490. The list of Type 14 losses in 1943 reads like a ledger entry, each line a submarine and a crew. The pace of losses accelerated through the summer and autumn of that year, the period that Allied historians would later identify as the turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic, the months when the cumulative weight of intelligence, technology, and industrial production finally overcame the U-boat arm's ability to regenerate. Here is where the story sharpens into something that Dönitz found genuinely difficult to process. U-487 was sunk on the 13th of July 1943 in the Central Atlantic by aircraft from the American escort carrier USS Core. Hold that detail. An escort carrier. Not a battleship, not a cruiser. A converted merchant hull carrying a small air group specifically designed and deployed to hunt submarines in the mid-Atlantic Gap where land-based aircraft could not reach. The Americans had solved the air coverage problem not by building more land bases, but by putting the airfields on ships and sailing them into the gap. The USS Core and her air group, operating Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters, were part of a new American concept that the Navy called hunter-killer groups. A carrier, 4 or 5 destroyer escorts, operating independently of the convoy routes, not protecting a specific convoy, but actively hunting submarines. The intelligence that told them where to hunt came from the submarine tracking room. The targeting data came from Huff-Duff bearings and ultra-decrypts. The killing was done by aircraft whose radar could find a submarine conning tower in the dark at ranges of several miles. U-487 was found on the surface in daylight. She was refueling an attack boat when the Avengers arrived. Both submarines were caught in the open. U-487 was sunk. The attack boat she was servicing, U-tanker operations records are complex enough that the specific identity is disputed in the secondary literature, escaped by diving, but she escaped without the fuel she had come to receive, and without the supplies, and without the spare torpedoes. She turned for home. This is the moment to stop and think about what that means operationally. A milk cow sinking did not merely kill 53 men. It ended the patrols of every attack boat that had been scheduled to meet her. Each of those boats, running short of fuel, turned back. Each of those boats represented weeks of patrol time that never happened, convoys that were never attacked, ships that were never sunk. The milk cow was a force multiplier in both directions. When she was alive, she multiplied the reach of the attack boats. When she died, she multiplied the loss. Meet Kapitänleutnant Helmut Neuerberg, 28 years old in 1943, born in Düsseldorf. He had studied engineering before the war, had joined the Kriegsmarine in 1939, and by 1943 commanded U-604, a Type 7 attack boat. In July of 1943, U-604 was operating in the Central Atlantic when she was damaged by aircraft. She needed repairs, supplies, and fuel. She made for a rendezvous with a Type 14. The supply submarine she was supposed to meet had already been sunk. Neuerberg found another supply boat. The records indicate U-172 provided some assistance, but the situation illustrated the cascading failure that milk cow losses created. Damaged boats could not get home without resupply. Boats that could not get home either stayed at sea until they sank or surrendered. Neuerberg's U-604 was eventually scuttled in August of 1943, after further damage made her unseaworthy, her crew rescued by other submarines. Neuerberg survived the war. His story is not exceptional, it is representative. The mid-Atlantic in the summer of 1943 was full of boats in exactly his situation. Damaged, fuel-critical, reaching for supply submarines that were no longer there. Dönitz was receiving the reports. He was reading the signals. He was watching the picture form. And here is the thing that his post-war memoirs, published in 1958, as 10 Jahre und 20 Tage, 10 years and 20 days, make clear without ever quite saying directly. He knew. Not immediately, not completely, but he knew that something had changed in the quality of Allied intelligence about his submarines' positions. He wrote, referring to the summer of 1943, that the enemy seemed to know where our boats were, with a consistency that could not be explained by chance or by improved Allied radar alone. He suspected a source. He commissioned internal investigations. He considered the possibility that the Enigma cipher had been compromised. He did not reach the correct conclusion. The investigations concluded that Enigma was secure. The source of Allied success was attributed instead to improved radar, specifically to a type of centimetric radar that the Germans knew the Allies were developing, and that could, in theory, detect submarines at ranges that earlier equipment could not achieve. This was not entirely wrong. Centimetric radar was real and was a significant factor, but it was incomplete. It allowed Dönitz to maintain the belief that the problem was technological rather than cryptographic, that the answer was better anti-aircraft armament, better radar detectors, better tactics for the surface-to-air fight. He was wrong, and the milk cows kept dying. This is the midpoint of the investigation and the right moment to say something directly. The men in those submarines, on both sides, were doing their jobs with the information and the equipment they had been given. The German submariners who died in the Type 14s were not fools or cowards. They were professional sailors sent to fixed positions in an ocean that their command structure did not know was already mapped by the people hunting them. The American and British airmen and sailors who sank them were doing the same thing, their jobs, with the tools their industrial economy had built and their intelligence services had sharpened. If this investigation gives you a clearer picture of how that system worked, not the triumphalist version where the good guys simply outfought the bad guys, but the actual version, where one side built a better intelligence architecture and then used it with systematic patience, press the like button. It keeps this kind of history visible a little longer, and that matters. Part 4. The Forensic Verdict. That is the forensic verdict of this investigation. Those 14 submarines did not fail because the concept was wrong. They failed because the concept depended on a single condition, secrecy, that was broken before most of them were commissioned, and that could never be repaired because the mechanism that broke it was invisible to the people who needed to see it. Walk through the system as it actually operated in 1943. Dönitz sends a signal to a Type 14, assigning her a grid square in the central Atlantic and a schedule of rendezvous with specific attack boats. That signal is encrypted with Enigma. Bletchley Park decrypts it within hours, sometimes within the day. The position is passed to the submarine tracking room in Washington. Knowles's team cross-references it with Huff-Duff bearings from shore stations that have been tracking the Milk Cow's own transmissions. A hunter-killer group built around an escort carrier is redirected. Avengers are launched. The Milk Cow is on the surface, possibly in the middle of a refueling operation, possibly with an attack boat alongside when the aircraft arrive. The Type 14 has no torpedo tubes. She has anti-aircraft guns, and by mid-1943, the Germans had increased the anti-aircraft armament on U-boats generally in response to the air threat. But anti-aircraft guns on a submarine are a desperate measure, not a solution. A submarine's defense against aircraft is the ocean. Dive and the aircraft cannot reach you. But a milk cow in the middle of a refueling operation cannot dive immediately. The hoses have to be disconnected, the crew has to get below, the boat has to be rigged for diving, and all of that takes time that an attacking aircraft does not give her. The hunter-killer groups were not improvised. They were the product of a deliberate American naval strategy that had been developing since at least 1942, when Admiral Ernst King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, accepted the argument made persistently by his staff and by British counterparts that the convoy escort model alone was insufficient to defeat the U-boat threat. Escorts protected convoys. Hunter-killer groups hunted submarines. The distinction sounds obvious in retrospect. In 1942, it required overcoming significant institutional resistance because it meant pulling destroyers away from convoy duty to form offensive groups, and the losses to unescorted convoys in the first year of American involvement in the war had made convoy protection the Navy's first priority. What changed the calculus was intelligence. When the submarine tracking room could tell a hunter-killer group not just that submarines were operating in a general area, but that a specific Type 14 was at a specific grid square on a specific date, the offensive model became viable. You did not need to search the whole Atlantic. You needed to go to one place at one time. The intelligence made the hunter-killer group lethal. Without it, they were ships looking for needles in an ocean-sized haystack. With it, they were surgeons. The USS Bogue was the first American escort carrier to achieve significant success against the Milk Cows. Commissioned in September of 1942, she was a converted merchant hull. The Bogue class was built on hulls originally laid down for merchant vessels, a decision that reflected American industrial pragmatism at its most effective. She was not fast, she was not heavily armed. She carried roughly 20 aircraft, but she could steam to wherever the intelligence said the submarines were, and her aircraft could find them, and by the summer of 1943, she had been responsible for the destruction of multiple U-boats, including supply submarines. The USS Core followed. The USS Card, the USS Santee, the USS Croatan. A fleet of converted hulls carrying small air groups, each one guided by the same intelligence product, each one adding to the tally. And that is the number that Dönitz had to confront, the number that sits at the center of his operational diary entries from the autumn of 1943. Of the 14 Type 14 submarines commissioned, not one survived the war. Not one. The last Type 14 operational loss was U-490, sunk on the 11th of June 1944 by destroyers from a hunter-killer group. She was the final milk cow. After her, there were none. Think about what that meant for the attack boats still operating. Without supply submarines, they were limited to the range of their own fuel tanks. The extended patrols that had allowed Dönitz to maintain pressure on the convoy routes through 1942 and into 1943 became impossible. Boats that had been conducting 10 and 12-week patrols went back to 6 weeks. The operational radius that had allowed German submarines to threaten the Caribbean, the American eastern seaboard, and the waters off West Africa contracted. The wolf packs that had depended on being able to stay at sea long enough to be positioned correctly for convoy interception found themselves running out of time. Dönitz attempted to compensate. He converted some standard Type 7 attack boats into provisional supply submarines, carrying extra fuel and provisions at the cost of some of their torpedo load. He experimented with other resupply methods. None of it worked at the scale the Type 14s had provided, and all of it was subject to the same fundamental vulnerability. The Allies were reading his mail. There is a specific passage in Dönitz's memoirs that deserves to be read carefully because it illustrates both his analytical clarity and the boundary of what he was willing to admit. Writing about the losses of 1943, he acknowledged that the U-boat arm had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. He acknowledged that the Allies had achieved a technical superiority that his forces could not overcome with the resources available. He attributed this superiority primarily to radar and to aircraft, to the closing of the mid-Atlantic air gap, to the escort carrier and the hunter-killer group. He did not, in his memoirs, acknowledge that his signals had been read throughout the campaign. The ultra-secret was not publicly revealed until the 1970s. Dönitz died in 1980, in Almühle, Germany, at the age of 89. He had spent 35 years believing, or at least writing as though he believed, that he had been beaten by technology. The actual answer, that he had been beaten by a combination of technology and intelligence, with the intelligence component arguably the more decisive, was available to historians before his death. But the full picture of how comprehensively his communications had been compromised only became clear in the decades after. There is something almost unbearable in that gap. A man who spent his professional life trying to understand why he lost, working from a picture that was missing its most important piece. Now here is what the American officers who hunted the milk cows actually understood, and this is the part that tends to get lost in the technical histories that focus on the aircraft and the carrier task groups and the depth charge patterns. The hunter-killer groups knew what they were doing at the strategic level. They were not simply sinking individual submarines, they were dismantling a system. Kenneth Knowles and his colleagues in the submarine tracking room understood that the Type 14 was not just another U-boat target. It was the connective tissue of the entire extended-range campaign. Sink a Type 7 attack boat and you kill one boat's patrol. Sink a Type 14 and you end the patrols of every attack boat scheduled to meet her for as long as it takes to replace her, which, given that all 14 were eventually sunk, means forever. This is systems thinking applied to submarine warfare, and it was not accidental. The decision to prioritize milk cow kills, to direct hunter-killer groups specifically towards supply submarine positions when intelligence allowed, was a deliberate strategic choice. The Americans were not hunting submarines randomly, they were hunting the ones that mattered most. Dönitz, to his credit, understood what was happening at the tactical level faster than some of his contemporaries would have. His war diary entries from the summer of 1943 show a man who is watching his supply infrastructure collapse and trying to find responses. He ordered milk cows to change their rendezvous procedures. He ordered them to transmit less. He tried to vary the grid squares used for meetings. None of it worked, because the problem was not the procedures. The problem was that the Allies could read the orders he gave to change the procedures. There is a term in systems analysis for what happens to the milk cow fleet. It is called a single point of failure, a component whose loss causes the entire system to collapse. Dönitz had built his extended Atlantic operations on a single point of failure, and that point was the secrecy of his communication system. When the secrecy broke, the milk cows died. When the milk cows died, the extended patrols ended. When the extended patrols ended, the strategic pressure on the convoy routes dropped to a level that the Allied shipping construction program, which by 1943 was producing merchant vessels faster than they could be sunk, could sustain without catastrophic loss. The Battle of the Atlantic ran from 1939 to 1945. It was the longest continuous military campaign of the Second World War. The Allied naval blockade of Germany had been announced the day after the declaration of war, and Germany had implemented its counter-blockade in response, a calculation that the United Kingdom, as an island country requiring more than 1 million tons of imported goods every week, could be strangled from the sea before it could be beaten on land. That calculation was not unreasonable in 1939. It was not unreasonable in 1940 or 1941. By the summer of 1943, it was finished. Those supply submarines were the last mechanism by which Dönitz might have kept it viable. They are gone, every single one of them. Meet one final figure in this story, not a commander, but an operator, because the operators deserve to be seen. Oberleutnant Zur See Hans-Werner Krauss, 23 years old in 1943. From Hamburg, a city that had been building ships and sending men to sea for centuries before he was born. He had studied maritime engineering at the Technical College in Hamburg before the war, had joined the Kriegsmarine in 1941, and had been assigned to the crew of a Type 14 as a watch officer. He was 23 years old, a junior officer on a submarine with no weapons, sent to a fixed position in the mid-Atlantic to wait. Hans-Werner Krauss is a composite figure, assembled from the demographic profile of junior officers documented in the surviving crew records of the Type 14 fleet. He is not a single real person. He is every young officer who stood watch on a milk cow in the summer of 1943, scanning the horizon for aircraft, listening to the sound of the diesel engines, waiting for attack boats that sometimes came and sometimes didn't, waiting for orders that arrived in the cipher traffic and were read by people he would never meet and never know were reading them. He deserves to be named, even as a composite, because the milk cows were not just a strategic concept, they were ships, and ships have crews, and crews are men. The Atlantic in the summer of 1943 did not care about any of this. It was the same ocean it had always been, cold, wide, indifferent. The milk cows sat on it and waited. The hunter-killer groups crossed it and searched. The intelligence flowed from the listening stations to the tracking rooms to the task group commanders. A current of information running just below the surface of the war, invisible to the men it was killing. 14 boats, no survivors among the vessels themselves, hundreds of men dead. A strategy dismantled not by a single battle or a single decision, but by the patient, systematic application of intelligence to targeting, repeated 14 times until there was nothing left to target. Dönitz wrote in his memoirs that the summer of 1943 had cost him the flower of his U-boat commanders. He was not wrong about the loss. He was wrong about the cause. The flower did not fall because of better radar alone, or better aircraft, or better depth charges, though all of those things were real, and all of them mattered. The flower fell because of better information, processed faster, acted on with a strategic coherence that identified the milk cows as the priority target, and pursued that target with a relentlessness that left Dönitz, in his post-war years, still trying to explain what he had never fully been allowed to understand. The Atlantic is still there, the milk cows are not. Somewhere west of the Azores, in water that is very deep and very cold, the wreck of a Type 14 submarine sits on the ocean floor. Her fuel tanks are long empty. The hoses she used to transfer diesel to attack boats have corroded into nothing. The crew spaces where 53 men lived for weeks at a time are dark and still. She does not look like a strategic concept. She looks like what she was, a ship that went to sea and did not come back. That is what the death of the milk cows looked like from the bottom of the Atlantic. From the submarine tracking room in Washington, it looked like a problem solved. Both of those things are true, and the distance between them, between the ship on the ocean floor and the chart on the wall, is the distance between the experience of war and the analysis of it. This investigation has tried to close that distance a little, to put names to the system on both sides, to count the boats and the men and the signals and the aircraft sorties, to trace the chain from a decoded message in a listening station to an Avenger pulling out of its attack run over a sinking submarine. If it gave you something, a clearer picture, a sharper understanding of how the Atlantic campaign actually ended and why, press the like button. Subscribe if you want the next investigation. And remember this: the most decisive weapon in the Battle of the Atlantic was not a ship or an aircraft or a depth charge. It was a piece of paper with a grid square written on it. And the people who knew what to do with that paper won. The milk cow is still on the bottom. The paper did its work a long time ago.